They found him face down in the dark, in a chamber designed not for habitation, but for forgetting. The walls of Berkeley Castle had absorbed the screams of many before him, but none echoed as violently in silence as the final hours of King Edward II. He had once been wrapped in coronation cloth, his skin kissed by bishops, his hand held steady by divine right. Now the same body lay rotting, unburied, mutilated, too humiliated for ceremony, too grotesque for honest record. Chroniclers wrote of his death with the linguistic equivalent of flinching. Some called it mysterious, others called it sudden. A few, bolder and more cryptic, hinted at a method so horrific that it had to be reduced to rumor just to be mentioned. And it is from those whispers, those fractured margins of medieval manuscript, that the most persistent horror arises, that a red-hot poker was used to penetrate his body, searing flesh from within, leaving no external wound, only internal devastation, both anatomical and symbolic. That a king, divinely appointed, ceremonially anointed, once draped in velvet and heralded as the Lord's chosen, is said to have died by an instrument of fire forced into his bowels, is not simply a grotesque tale. It is a historical wound that refuses to close. The death was not just execution, it was erasure, a kind of punishment that sought to undo the very idea of royalty. There were no trumpets, no final blessings, no dirges sung in open air. Instead, there was a body that reeked of fire and feces, of cruelty so calculated that no chronicler dared write its full truth. And so they wrote lies instead. They said he died of melancholy. They said he died of grief. They said his death was quiet. And yet every shadow cast by that silence screamed something else entirely. That this was not justice, but desecration. That this was not punishment, but ritual humiliation. And that even in death, Edward's body was not his own. To understand why a king was made to die without dignity, one must first understand how his reign became an insult to power itself. Edward II was not the king his father had been. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, had forged his rule in conquest and iron. His son inherited not only the crown, but the expectation of force, command, and martial virtue. But Edward II brought softness where his father had brought steel. He surrounded himself not with noble warriors, but with favorites. First Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despencer, men whose influence at court grew not from governance or loyalty to England, but from their closeness to the king's private heart. Whether those relationships were romantic or merely preferential no longer matters. What matters is how they were perceived. The barons, the bishops, even the queen, Isabella, daughter of the King of France, saw in Edward's intimacy a weakness that would undo the entire edifice of monarchy. The court whispered, Parliament bristled. Gaveston was exiled, then returned, then executed by the very nobles who swore fealty to the crown. But Edward's defiance did not break. It curdled. After Gaveston's death, he gave himself more fully to Despencer, and it was Despencer who came to symbolize everything the nobility feared, a parasite clothed in the robes of royal favor, wielding power not by birthright or service, but by seduction and manipulation. Under Despencer's influence, Edward's rule became a vendetta. Land was seized. Opponents were imprisoned. Torture was not only tolerated, it was organized. The kingdom's legal structures, once bent to enforce order, were twisted to protect the king's inner circle and punish his outer world. This was not tyranny in the classical sense. It was pettiness empowered by law. And while England trembled beneath the weight of baronial anger, the Queen was watching. Isabella had been humiliated, cast aside for Despencer, treated as a political inconvenience rather than a partner in rule. Sent to France on diplomatic errands, she did not return alone. With her came Roger Mortimer, an exile-turned-lover, a noble-turned-revolutionary. Together, they plotted not just to reclaim the throne, but to destroy it as Edward had made it. Their invasion in 1326 was swift, almost anticlimactic. Despencer was captured, tried, and mutilated in a public spectacle of revenge. Edward, once king of all England, was found hiding in the marshes of Wales, abandoned by the same guards who had once sworn to die in his name. He was taken not to trial, but to shadow. Parliament, under pressure from Isabella and Mortimer, declared him unfit to rule. His son, Edward III, barely a teenager, was placed on the throne, and the father, now crownless, was not merely retired. He was vanished, placed in confinement, stripped of authority, his royal seal broken, his documents burned, his name spoken in lowered tones. They did not call it a coup. They called it necessity. But what it truly was unmaking, not of a man, of a monarch. He had been king, and now he was not. And for those who tore the crown from his head, mere dethronement was not enough. His reign had been a disgrace. His death would be the answer. Berkeley Castle was never meant to be a prison, but it became one in all the ways that mattered. Cold stone walls, narrow windows that filtered more mold than light, corridors that echoed with silence more than speech. This is where they placed him. Not as a guest, not even as a traitor, but as something less, an embarrassment to history, a thing that had to be kept breathing but unseen. Edward II, once surrounded by ceremony and silk, now found his companions reduced to guards with no orders to protect, only to contain. They fed him just enough. They clothed him just barely. They spoke to him only when required, and even then, without names. The ritual of kingship was gone. What remained was the bare minimum of survival, and even that was delivered with contempt. There are no detailed records of Edward's thoughts during this time. He left no journals. No letters survive in his own hand. What we know comes from the observation of others, fragments in correspondence, guarded mentions in legal petitions, whispers recorded years later. But the silence speaks louder than any ink. In captivity, he was denied not just power, but personhood. They did not kill him immediately, because they feared what his martyrdom might ignite, but they also could not allow him to exist with memory intact, and so they erased him slowly, beginning not with his body, but with his meaning. No heraldry, no messengers, no declarations of where the former king resided, only guarded movement, closed doors, and carefully timed misinformation. Those who saw him during these months noted that he had become pale, skeletal, increasingly detached. He no longer spoke unless spoken to, and even then replied in shortened syllables, as though speech itself had become foreign. Some claimed he prayed loudly in the night. Others said he had to be restrained during fits. But none denied that he was deteriorating, not from illness, but from engineered invisibility. The king had once commanded armies. Now he could not command the warmth of a blanket or the trust of a guard. There are mentions of him being moved between rooms, placed under heavier chains, denied sunlight for extended periods. Whether these were acts of security or acts of cruelty no longer matters. The result was the same. The king's mind began to rot before his flesh. What makes his imprisonment particularly cruel is that it was not designed for redemption or repentance. It was designed for decomposition, not just of the man, but of what he had represented. To keep him alive was to control the narrative, to show the world that even a king could be made to crawl, to hunger, to whimper. Every day that Edward lived within those walls was a reminder to the nobility, to the people, to his son, that the crown could be unfastened not only from the head, but from the soul. His guards did not simply watch him, they studied him, and what they saw was a monarch being unstitched by silence. It begins as a rumor. It always does. In the absence of clear detail, in the vacuum left by silence and official denial, something darker slips in. A shape, a suggestion, and in the case of Edward II, it took the form of heat, of fire, of an object designed not to kill quickly, but to communicate humiliation through anatomy. The red-hot poker, inserted rectally, slowly, deliberately, became the legend that defined his death, not because it was witnessed, but because it was whispered, and the whisper was never denied. The earliest references to the method appear years after his death, cloaked in ambiguous language. Chroniclers wrote of a manner of death too shameful to name, or that his bowels were burned from within, leaving no mark upon the skin. These were not medical notes. They were code, and every scribe who copied them knew what they meant but dared not make them literal, because to describe it openly was to admit that the body of a king had been not merely killed but penetrated, violated in a way that turned flesh into metaphor, power into parody. And yet, forensic logic lends the rumor a horrific plausibility. If a red-hot metal rod were inserted into the rectum, it would not rupture the skin externally. The damage would occur internally: burned tissue, ruptured intestines, internal bleeding, shock. The victim would scream, would seize, would die slowly, either from the burns themselves or from sepsis in the hours that followed. There would be no stab wound, no cut throat, just a corpse that collapsed in on itself, seemingly untouched. For those who wanted Edward dead, but invisible in death, this would have been ideal. But it is not the physics of the murder that makes it unforgettable. It is the symbolism. The body of a monarch had long been considered sacred, anointed, untouchable, a vessel for divine rule. To enter that body by force, to transform the royal body into a site of penetration and fire, was not just punishment, it was desecration. And the fact that the act targeted the very part of the body associated, however controversially, with Edward's rumored sexuality made the message unmistakable. This was not just death. This was condemnation. This was message-making through mutilation. And so the rumor endures, not because it was proven, but because no other explanation carries the same clarity of vengeance. A king who had ruled with softness, who had loved men, who had dared to place his affection above politics. He was not just removed, he was unmade through the very thing he had been mocked for. His enemies didn't just want him dead, they wanted his memory to die in embarrassment. What makes the red-hot poker story so potent is that it was too specific not to haunt, and too effective not to spread. Chroniclers who normally spoke in code left curious gaps in their accounts. Others hinted at the act while pretending to scoff at it. Still others, centuries later, repeated the tale with increasing certainty, because the horror of it felt truer than any quiet lie could. The image lingers because it was never officially addressed, because the records are missing, because the silence of those who witnessed Edward's final moments speaks louder than any confession. And in that silence, history made room for a method that became myth. Not because it was impossible, but because it said everything that power could not allow itself to admit. If Edward II had simply been executed, beheaded, stabbed, hanged, his death would have entered the ledger of fallen kings with a footnote, not a shadow. But those who orchestrated his final humiliation did not want a martyr. They wanted a memory erased, and that required more than death. It required symbolic annihilation. Edward's murder was not conducted in the heat of rebellion, nor as a matter of battlefield justice. It was a carefully choreographed event, silent, precise, and loaded with subtext. The choice of method, if the rumor is true, was not merely sadistic. It was political theater performed without an audience, but designed to echo for centuries. At the center of this vengeance stood Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. Their coup had been successful. Edward was deposed, imprisoned, and forgotten by law. But law was not enough. His existence, however diminished, was still a threat. He remained a symbol. To the loyalists, to the church, to any who questioned the legality of his removal, the deposed king might still be seen as legitimate. And so, like the destruction of a relic, Edward's body had to be defiled in a way that made restoration unthinkable. They could not allow him to die a sovereign. He had to die a scandal. This was not vengeance in its raw form. It was refined, ritualized cruelty. To destroy the body in such an unspeakable way was to strip it of sanctity, to make the site of violation the rectum, associated in medieval Christian discourse with sin, filth, and perversion, was to turn the king into an object of contempt. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted him mocked by history. And in that design, they succeeded. For what greater insult could there be than to die in pain so obscene that chroniclers dared not describe it. The silence in the records is revealing. It was not an oversight. It was a tool. By refusing to describe the act, the scribes allowed the imagination to fill in what the monarchy could not stomach to record. The very vagueness of the reports, a manner too vile to describe, functioned as a mask and a mirror. It protected the perpetrators and reflected the audience's darkest suspicions. And so Edward's death became a parable without details, a grotesque morality tale where the crime was so perfectly tailored to the man's reputation that it burned itself into legend. The method was also a warning. Future kings took note. Rule poorly, love wrongly, favor the wrong men, and your end will not be dignified. It will not be documented. It will not even be remembered cleanly. It will be hinted at in disgust, spoken of in back rooms, and passed from generation to generation as a cautionary tale dressed in myth. In this way, Edward's body became a message, and like all messages sent by power, it did not need to be signed to be understood. Edward II was not merely dethroned, he was erased. His legacy boiled down to a rumor of fire and silence, and those who ordered it, Isabella, Mortimer, the shadowed figures who held him down, never confessed. They didn't need to. The method confessed for them. The silence was strategic. After Edward's death, those who had orchestrated it understood that the method, though hidden from public view, was already too loud in its implications, and so history itself was made to bend. Chroniclers who had detailed battles in blood-soaked verses now became cautious, their pens halting where detail should have been. Adam Murrameth, who had served under Edward, merely noted his passing with flat detachment. Other clerks described his end with phrases like, "He died by the will of others," or "by secret means." Not false, but deliberately incomplete. The horror was not erased. It was left unfinished. These silences were not born from ignorance. They were acts of control. Chroniclers in royal service were not simply recording the past. They were shaping the memory of a regime. To describe the poker would be to accuse. To name the violence would be to indict Mortimer. To stain Isabella, to risk destabilizing the fragile legitimacy of Edward III, a child king whose rule now depended on pretending that what had just happened to his father had never occurred. So they wrote around it. They replaced the event with euphemism. A king had died. That was all. In some records, death came naturally. In others, from melancholy or from grief. One account even stated that he fell ill and expired, as was fitting for his station. But what station allows a red-hot poker? What illness leaves no mark but burns the soul from the inside? These accounts were not errors, they were shields, and through them, England was taught not to question. There are glimpses, half-escaped truths embedded in later accounts. Jean Froissart, writing decades after the event, referenced the manner of Edward's death as too vile for open speech. Thomas de la Mort, whose closeness to Edward III should have granted him authority, relayed the rumor with a hint of irony, leaving the truth in the reader's hands. These were not testimonies. They were confessions of fear, the fear of naming an act too brutal for public endorsement, yet too specific to fabricate without basis. Even archaeology yields no clarity. His tomb remains, but his body was never exhumed. No forensic inquiry has pierced the earth to determine the truth, and perhaps that is fitting. The horror of Edward's death lives in its unprovability. The unsaid becomes more haunting than the said. The absence of documentation becomes the proof of atrocity. Censorship in the case of Edward II did not mean redaction. It meant narrative design, to protect the line of succession, to guard the monarchy, to keep England's image clean while its foundation reeked of unspoken fire. The red-hot poker remains not in parchment, but in the space between words. It was never written, because it never needed to be. Everyone already understood. To penetrate a king was not merely to end his life. It was to transform him from subject to object, from sovereign to spectacle. Edward II's body, once elevated above all others, had become a site of deliberate inversion. For centuries, the monarch's physical form had been revered as an extension of divine order. To anoint the body was to sanctify the state. Coronation robes, relics of royal touch, the ceremonial washing of hands, each ritual reinforced the illusion that the ruler's body was more than human. But in death, Edward's form was not protected, it was exploited. The act, if the rumor is true, used his body to send a message more lasting than any decree or edict. No man, not even a king, is safe from desecration when he defies the order of power. What happened inside that cell in Berkeley Castle was not random brutality. It was calculated symbolism. The red-hot iron, if it was used, reversed the direction of authority. Edward had once ruled from the throne. Now, pain entered him from below. It was humiliation through anatomy, a rewriting of his kingship in flesh and fire. And it forced a question that no court historian would dare answer. What does sovereignty mean if the body can be reduced to an orifice? In this way, Edward's death became the perfect erasure, a political liability neutralized not with poison or blade, but with a grotesque form of sexualized punishment that could never be openly acknowledged without unraveling the sacred fabric of kingship. To kill a king was one thing. To desecrate him was to rewrite his memory into something unrepeatable. To strip him of symbolic dignity ensured that no loyalist could call him martyr, no rebellion could claim his image. He did not die as a figure of loss. He died as a warning, his mutilated body too shameful for even his enemies to celebrate. And still, the message spread. The very horror of the act ensured its endurance. Edward's torment passed from rumor to ritual in the public imagination. He became a fable whispered in baronial halls and ecclesiastical chambers. The king who was unmade, not through sword or poison, but through unspeakable intimacy. A body defiled to preserve political order. A king reduced to proof that power will protect itself, not just by force, but by degradation. What remained was not a man, not even a ruler, but a question. If a king's body could be used this way, what protections do any of us have? Edward's legacy, embalmed not in honor, but in horror, became a shadow lesson in the anatomy of control. Edward II is not remembered for his laws. He is not remembered for reforms, for conquest, or for speeches carved in marble. He is remembered as a whisper, a mutilated body in a locked chamber, a death that no official voice could describe. And in that silence lies the most enduring truth of all. Power controls not just the living, but the memory of the dead. It edits the past as easily as it executes the present. What survives is not always what happened, but what was permitted to be remembered. And Edward was not permitted dignity, even in retrospect. His death, if it occurred as rumored, was an act of message-making so potent that it required centuries of silence to dull its edge. The red-hot poker was not just a weapon. It was a theory, a philosophy of annihilation, an argument that said, "We will destroy you so completely, so intimately, that even your defenders will flinch from speaking your name. We will burn not just your body, but your legacy, not through fire alone, but through shame. And we will ensure that no monument can rise from what remains." And yet, shame does not always bury memory. Sometimes it preserves it. Edward's death, censored though it was, lives on not despite its horror, but because of it. Every ellipsis in the chronicle, every cautious phrase, every avoidance becomes part of the narrative. The red-hot poker exists precisely because no one dared record it plainly. In that absence, the myth has grown teeth. What does it mean, then, when a king's story ends not with glory or repentance, but with silence and fire? It means that sovereignty is not invincible. It can be undone, not just by rebellion or sword, but by ridicule, by violation, by being reduced to meat. It means that a man crowned in God's name can be ended like any other prisoner, with instruments of heat and hands that do not flinch. And it asks one more question, a question not about Edward, but about us. Why do we remember this story? Why does it survive, pass through hands and mouths and whispers? It survives because it reminds us of what power is willing to do when threatened. It survives because it reveals the cost of disobedience, not just in blood, but in narrative, in dignity, in how the dead are allowed to be seen. Edward II died in secret, his body burned from the inside, his name buried under euphemism. But the story remains, and so does the warning, that power, when stripped of restraint, will not merely destroy its enemies, it will erase them from body, from record, from memory, unless we choose to look.